Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Rao's IAS Study Circle.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 5th of December 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Time-stamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now before going through today's news analysis, please test yourself through these questions. The answers to these questions have been given at the end of the video discussion. Now, this particular article appears on page number 1. Recently, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India has announced its monetary policy stance. Under the latest monetary policy stance, the MPC has decided to maintain the repo rate at 4%. So, the MPC has decided to maintain the status quo on the policy rates for the third time in a row. See, usually whenever an economy is facing the slowdown, the MPC decides to reduce the policy rates. So the reduction in the policy rates will in turn translate into reduction in the rate of interest of the loans, leading to increase in the consumption expenditure, increase in the investment expenditure, and thus an economy would be able to come out of the economic slowdown. However, the MPC has decided to maintain the status quo on the policy rates. This is so because the rate of inflation presently in the Indian economy, as measured by the CPI, this is as high as around 7.6%. So as you must be aware, the RBI is required to maintain the rate of inflation between 2 to 6%. And since the present rate of inflation is much above the targeted range, the RBI has decided to keep the policy rates unchanged. Now the article that we are going to discuss here becomes quite important as far as the prelims is concerned. This is so because if you look at Indian economy, in Indian economy you have different themes that are important from the perspective of prelims, such as banking and finance, international trade, government schemes and policies, external sector, taxation, core concepts and so on. And as you can see here, in the previous 4-year prelims examination, on a consistent basis, at least 5 to 7 questions have been asked from the chapter of the banking and finance. The same trend has continued even in the UPSC 2020 as well. So as you can see, a number of questions have been asked in the previous year prelims with respect to the concept of the monetary policy as well as from the chapter of banking and finance. As far as this particular article is concerned, apart from keeping the policy rates unchanged, the Monetary Policy Committee has taken a number of important decisions. It has decided to expand the targeted long-term repo operations. It has decided to introduce the liquidity adjustment facility for the regional rural banks. And it has also sought to introduce the guidelines for the issuance of the money market instruments as well as the credit default swap. So as part of this particular video analysis, we'll understand as to what exactly are the targeted long-term repo operations and how it is going to benefit the Indian economy, the concept of the liquidity adjustment facility and certain details about the regional rural banks, the concept of the credit default swap and how it is going to benefit the Indian economy, and certain important aspects about the money market instruments such as the commercial paper, certificate of deposit, caller notice money and so on. So let us start our analysis with the first aspect, that is the concept of the repo and the long-term repo operations. As you all must be aware, the main role of the RBI is to control the total amount of money supply in the Indian economy. So whenever the Indian economy is facing the economic slowdown, the Reserve Bank of India would be required to inject the money into the economy. On the other hand, when the Indian economy is facing higher rate of inflation, the RBI would be required to suck out the excess liquidity. Hence, in order to control the total amount of money supply, the RBI has a number of tools at its disposal. Some of these tools include the repo rate, reverse repo, marginal standing facility, statutory liquidity ratio, and the cash reserve ratio. As far as the repo rate is concerned, repo rate is basically the rate at which the banks borrow loans from the Reserve Bank of India. So, during the economic slowdown, the Reserve Bank of India would be required to reduce the repo rate. So as the banks borrow money from the RBI at a lower rate of interest, this will in turn lead to injection of more amount of money into the economy. On the other hand, during the higher rate of inflation, the RBI would increase the repo rate. So as the repo rate is increased, the cost of borrowing by the banks would increase, and thus this will in turn reduce the total amount of money supply in the Indian economy. And as you can see here, under the repo, you have basically two legs of transaction. In the first leg of transaction, the banks basically sell the government securities such as the treasury bills and government bonds to the RBI. And by selling the government securities, the banks borrow money. Say for example, the bank here is selling a government security worth rupees 100. So by selling the government security worth rupees 100, it will be able to borrow money worth rupees 100 rupees from the RBI. Now, in this case, when the first leg of the transaction takes place, usually there is an agreement between the banks and the RBI. Under this particular agreement, the banks would agree to repurchase the government securities from the RBI at a future date after a certain period of time. Now, the rate at which the banks repurchase the government securities is simply referred to as the repo rate. Now, the second leg of transaction may take place after 7 days, 14 days, 28 days, 56 days, and so on. So all of this is considered to be the maturity period on the repo rate. So upon the maturity period, the banks would be required to repurchase the government securities. Hence, by repurchasing the government securities, the banks would be giving back the borrowed money along with the rate of interest. Now, for example, let's say the maturity period is 7 days and the repo rate in this particular case is 4%. So after the 7 days here, the bank would be required to repurchase the same government security worth rupees 100. But here, when it is repurchasing, it will not repurchase at rupees 100. Rather, it will repurchase this government security at 104. So it is 100 rupees, which is the principal amount, plus 4 rupees, that is the rate of interest. So even though the face value of the government security would continue to remain at rupees 100, the bank here is repurchasing the government security at 104. Thus, by doing so, the bank is giving back the borrowed money along with the rate of interest of 4%. Now, depending upon the maturity period of the repos, we have two types of repos, that is the overnight repos and the term repos. Overnight repos have a maturity period of 1 day, whereas the term repos have a maturity period of 7 days, 14 days, 28 days, 56 days, and so on. The rate of interest on the overnight repos is usually equal to the repo rate. However, in case of the term repos are auctioned by the Reserve Bank of India. So whichever bank wants to borrow the money from the RBI for the term repo, such a bank would be required to bid for the repo. So whichever bank is bidding for the highest rate of interest to be paid to the Reserve Bank of India, such a bank would be allowed to borrow the money from the RBI through the term repos. So since there is a bidding for the rate of interest which is carried out by the banks, usually the rate of interest on the term repos is higher than the repo rate. Now coming to the targeted long-term repo operations, as the name suggests, these are a form of term repos with a much longer maturity period. The maturity period of the long-term repo operations may range from 1 to 3 years. But one of the main difference here is, if you look at the term repos, usually the rate of interest on the term repos is higher than the repo rate. However, in case of the targeted long-term repo operations, the rate of interest is equal to the repo rate. So the rate of interest on the targeted long-term repo operations is not higher than the repo rate. Rather, it is equal to the repo rate. The Reserve Bank of India has introduced this particular tool in order to inject almost around rupees 1 lakh crore into the banking system. However, the condition that has been imposed on the banks here is, whatever money is availed by the banks under this particular route, this money has to be given in the form of loans by the banks to only certain specified sectors only. That is why it is known as targeted. So the Reserve Bank of India has come out with a list of sectors to which the banks can give loans under this particular route. So the banks can give loans only to those sectors and they cannot give loans to the other sectors. Now there are a number of benefits associated with the targeted long-term repo operations. First and foremost, it will lead to reduction in the rate of interest on the long-term loans. It will increase the credit creation within the Indian economy and thus promote economic growth and development. Now earlier the targeted long-term repo operations was applicable only to some of the sectors, but now the RBI has expanded the list of sectors which can avail the loans under this particular route. The second decision of the Monetary Policy Committee is to extend the liquidity adjustment facility even to the regional rural banks. Presently, the liquidity adjustment facility of the Reserve Bank of India is available to all the scheduled banks. However, it was not available to the regional rural banks. Now, the Monetary Policy Committee has decided to extend the liquidity adjustment facility even for the regional rural banks in order to infuse the liquidity into the Indian economy. Now, the regional rural banks have been set up in India based upon the recommendations of the Narasimhan Committee under the Regional Rural Banks Act 1976. They have been set up basically in order to meet the credit and banking requirements of the agriculture sector, micro, small and medium enterprises, and so on. The RRBs have a unique ownership pattern wherein the central government owns 50%, the concerned state government owns 15%. For each and every regional rural bank, there is a sponsor bank which happens to be a scheduled bank, and such a sponsor bank owns 35% ownership in the RRB. The RRBs are also required to follow various prudential norms such as the cash reserve ratio, statutory liquidity ratio as laid down by the Reserve Bank of India, and they are required to give 75% of their loans towards the sectors that have been categorized as a priority sectors. As far as the scheduled commercial banks is concerned, for the scheduled commercial banks, the target for the priority sector lending is 40%. Now, the liquidity adjustment facility basically comprises of two components, that is repo and reverse repo. The banks can also avail the marginal standing facility. As far as the MSF and repo is concerned, both these tools are used by the banks in order to borrow money from the Reserve Bank of India. Hence, in a way, these two tools are used by the RBI in order to inject the liquidity into the economy. However, the difference is in the duration of the bank's borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India. Usually, the banks rely on the marginal standing facility for the overnight borrowing, whereas the banks can rely on the repo rate for the short-term loans. The short-term loans, as discussed before, could be of 7 days, 14 days, 28 days, 56 days, and so on. The second difference between MSF and repo is in terms of the collateral used by the banks in order to borrow money under these two routes. I hope all of you must be aware about the concept of the statutory liquidity ratio. So all the banks in case of India, they are required to keep aside a certain percentage of the depositors' money. They have to keep aside this percentage of the depositors' money in the form of cash, gold, or the government securities. This is referred to as the statutory liquidity ratio. So the banks in case of India can have the government securities either as part of SLR or they can have government securities outside the SLR. See, when the banks borrow money from the Reserve Bank of India under the repo rate, the banks cannot use the government securities which are part of SLR. The banks must compulsorily use the government securities which are outside SLR in order to borrow money from the RBI under the repo route. However, it may so happen that a particular bank does not have any government securities outside SLR. Whatever government securities it has, all the government securities are part of SLR and it is in immediate need of money for one day. In that case, the banks can avail the liquidity from the RBI under the MSF route. So under the MSF route, the banks sell the government securities which are part of SLR to the RBI in order to borrow, and later at the end of the day, the banks then repurchase the same government security. So as you can see, in case of the marginal standing facility, the banks are using the government securities which are part of SLR, which in a way shows that for one single day, the banks are not being able to maintain the statutory liquidity ratio. That is why the rate of interest on the MSF is higher than the repo rate. So if you compare the rate of interest on MSF and repo, even though MSF is a short-term borrowing, the MSF rate is higher than the repo rate. And lastly, as far as the reverse repo is concerned, see, the reverse repo is exact opposite of repo. Under the repo, it is the banks that borrow the money from the Reserve Bank of India. However, in case of reverse repo, it is the RBI that is borrowing the money from the banks. So the question is, why is RBI borrowing the money from the banks? So by borrowing the money from the banks, RBI in a way is sucking out the excess liquidity from the Indian economy. So while the repo rate is used by the RBI in order to inject liquidity, the reverse repo is used by the RBI in order to suck out the excess liquidity from the Indian economy. Usually, the reverse repo is lower than the repo. So if you have to arrange these policy rates in the descending order, the highest rate is MSF followed by repo, and repo is followed by reverse repo. The lowest rate is of the reverse repo. Apart from that, please do let us know as to what should happen to the reverse repo during the economic slowdown. That is, during the economic slowdown, should the Reserve Bank of India increase or decrease the reverse repo? Now coming to the concept of the credit default swap. For the first time in the year 2013, the Reserve Bank of India had come out with a detailed guidelines related to the issuance of the credit default swap. Through such guidelines, the RBI sought to strengthen and deepen the corporate bond market. Now the Monetary Policy Committee has highlighted that it would further streamline the guidelines related to the issuance of the credit default swap in order to further strengthen the corporate bond market. I hope all of you must be aware about the concept of the corporate bonds. See, whenever any company is in need of money, the company may borrow the money from the investors through the issuance of the corporate bonds. The corporate bonds do have a face value, maturity period, and a rate of interest. So if you buy a corporate bond worth rupees 100 for a maturity period of 5 years with a rate of interest of 5%, at the end of 5 years, you as an investor, you would be entitled to get back rupees 105 from the company. See, the corporate bond market, especially in countries such as USA, is quite well developed, wherein in any company wants to borrow money, usually the company resorts to the route of the corporate bonds in order to raise the loans. However, as far as India is concerned, in case of India, the corporate bond market is not so well developed. So usually the companies rely more on banks in order to borrow loans rather than relying on the corporate bonds. See, one of the biggest constraints for the development of corporate bonds market in case of India happens to be the risk aversion of the investors. Usually the investors are reluctant to invest in the corporate bonds issued by number of companies, including the startup companies. This is so because the investors feel that what if after the maturity period the company does not have sufficient amount of money to repay back their investment. That is why the investors in case of India are reluctant to invest in the corporate bonds. In order to solve this particular problem, we do have a concept of the credit default swap. Now the credit default swap works in a manner which is similar to the working mechanism of a health insurance. Now you as a person, you can avail health insurance by paying a certain amount of premium to a health insurance company. So in case if you get hospitalized or in case if you need any kind of major surgery, then the health insurance company would be required to bear the financial burden. So in a way, you're trying to reduce your risk by paying a premium on the health insurance. Similarly, in this particular case, if an investor wants to reduce his risk of investment in a corporate bond, he can buy a credit default swap from another company. So we do have certain specialized companies that sell the credit default swap. So when this investor buys a credit default swap on this particular corporate bond from another company, so in future, if this company that issues a corporate bond defaults on its repayment, then this company would be required to bear the financial burden. So whatever is the face value of this particular corporate bond, the face value plus the interest would be required to be paid by this particular company. So in a way, you are reducing your risk in the corporate bond by buying the credit default swap. So we do have certain specialized companies in case of India that sell the credit default swap. So for the first time, the RBI had issued guidelines in the year 2013 for the issuance of the credit default swap, and now the RBI is set to come out with a new guidelines. So the main benefits of the credit default swap is it will reduce the risk of investment in the corporate bonds, and hence it will help in deepening the corporate bond market, and it will also enable the startup companies as well as micro, small and medium enterprises to raise money through the issuance of the corporate bonds. Lastly, the Reserve Bank of India has decided to come out with the detailed guidelines related to the issuance of the money market instruments. These guidelines will basically lay down as to who can be the participants in the money market, what should be the eligibility criteria to issue the money market instruments, how these money market instruments can be traded, and so on. Now, all of these aspects do not become important from the perspective of the UPSC examination. What is important is what exactly is money market, how money market is different from the capital market, and what are the various money market instruments. See, the financial market in case of India has basically two segments, that is the capital market and the money market. Capital market is that part of the financial market that is basically used by the companies in order to raise medium and long-term capital. When we say medium and long-term capital, it is usually referred to a period which is greater than 1 year. On the other hand, the money market is usually used by the companies in order to raise short-term capital ranging from 1 day to less than 1 year. The participants in the capital market include the companies, financial institutions, banks, the foreign investors which are referred to as the foreign portfolio investors, government, retail investors like you and me, and so on. The participants in the money market include RBI, banks, financial institutions, Discontent Finance House of India. As far as the Discontent Finance House of India is concerned, this is an institution that has been set up jointly by RBI and the banks in order to provide the necessary liquidity to the money market instruments. So in case if you buy any money market instrument, at any point of time, you can sell off this money market instrument to the Discontent Finance House of India. So in a way, this particular institution is involved in the development of the money market in India. The different instruments which are used in the capital market include shares, bonds, debentures, exchange traded funds, and so on. The money market instruments include commercial paper, certificate of deposit, call or notice money. The commercial paper, it is similar to a corporate bond issued by a company. However, the difference here is the maturity period of a corporate bond is always greater than 1 year, whereas the maturity period of a commercial paper is less than 1 year. Next, we have the certificate of deposit. Now, certificate of deposit is a financial instrument that is issued by the bank. The certificate of deposit is similar to the fixed deposit. However, the difference here is usually the maturity period of the fixed deposit is greater than 1 year, whereas the maturity period of the certificate of deposit is less than 1 year. Secondly, the fixed deposit's value can be as low as rupees 10,000. However, the minimum amount which you need to invest in certificate of deposit, it can be as high as rupees 1 lakh. So, the basic difference between fixed deposit and certificate of deposit is in terms of maturity period as well as the minimum amount that can be invested. Next, we have the call or the notice money. Now, call or notice money is basically a tool which is used by the banks in order to borrow money from the other banks. So, these are basically tools which are used for interbank lending. Now, for example, let's say if ICICI Bank wants to borrow money from the State Bank of India for a period of 1 day, then it is referred to as a call money. On the other hand, if the ICICI Bank borrows money from the State Bank of India for a period which is greater than 1 day but less than 14 days, then it is referred to as the notice money. So the difference between call and the notice money is call money is used for borrowing from one bank to another for a period of 1 day, whereas the notice money is used for a period greater than 1 day but less than 14 days. The capital market instruments such as shares, bonds, etc. are considered to be quite risky, whereas the money market instruments are considered to be less risky. The capital market instruments are considered to have lower liquidity. Now, for example, if you have bought a share at rupees 100 and if the value of this particular share is continuously declining, then you may find it difficult to sell off this share in the share market. However, in case of money market, in case if you buy a money market instrument such as commercial paper, certificate of deposit, etc., at any point of time you can sell off this money market instrument to the Discontent Finance House of India, and thus you can easily convert your investment into cash. So there is a greater liquidity in the money market as compared to the capital market. The regulator for the capital market, as you know, is the Securities Exchange Board of India. The regulator in case of money market is both RBI as well as SEBI. A major part of the money market is regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. However, certain aspects of the money market, such as the investment of the mutual fund companies in various money market instruments, that investment is regulated by the Securities Exchange Board of India. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. As far as the answers to the questions that were asked in previous year prelims are concerned, I have highlighted these answers as you can see on the screen. In case of any confusion, please do let us know in the comment section given below. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 13 and is titled as China Turns on the Artificial Sun. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Science and Technology. See, presently most of the nuclear reactors across the world, including India, work on the principle of nuclear fission reaction. Construction of nuclear reactors which work on the principle of nuclear fusion is considered to be a technological challenge. This is so because in order to construct the nuclear fusion reactor, we would have to generate heat which is almost equal to 6 times the temperature in the core of the sun. Now this article highlights that China has achieved this technological breakthrough by launching its first nuclear fusion reactor. Because of the enormous heat which it generates, it is also referred to as the artificial sun. The launch of this nuclear fusion reactor in China is said to provide China with environment friendly and clean energy. See, as far as the prelims is concerned, you should basically understand the types of nuclear reactions and the difference between them. Now, in case of the nuclear fission reaction, an heavier and unstable nuclei splits into the lighter nuclei. These heavier and unstable nuclei could be uranium, plutonium, thorium, etc. Take for instance uranium 235. So when this heavier and unstable uranium 235, when it is bombarded with a neutron, this splits into lighter nuclei such as barium and krypton. It also releases 3 neutrons as well. Now when this particular reaction is completed, the mass of uranium 235, this is much higher than combined mass of barium and krypton. So this shows that a certain amount of mass is lost here. Now, even though the amount of mass which is lost here may be quite less, this in turn leads to generation of huge amount of energy. This is so because I hope you must be knowing the formula of E is equal to mc square. So where c represents the speed of the light. So total amount of energy that gets released in this particular reaction would be mc square. So even though the total amount of mass lost in this particular reaction is quite less, the amount of energy that gets released is quite higher. So this particular energy that gets released, this energy can be used to heat the water, turn the water into steam, and the steam can then be used to turn the turbines in the nuclear reactors. However, in case of nuclear fusion reaction, two positively charged lighter nuclei come together to form the heavier nuclei. Take for instance deuterium and tritium. These two are considered to be the isotopes of hydrogen. They are considered to be the lighter nuclei. So these positively charged lighter nuclei come together, they fuse and then form the heavier helium nuclei. Now in this particular case, the total mass of deuterium and tritium, this mass is much higher than the mass of helium. So certain amount of mass is lost in this particular reaction. And once again, based upon the principle of E is equal to mc square, huge amount of energy is released. This energy can then be used to turn the water into steam. Steam can then be used to turn the turbine in the nuclear reactors. So if you look at the basic differences between the nuclear fusion and nuclear fission reaction, in case of nuclear fission reactors, the fuel that can be used include uranium, plutonium, thorium, etc. Whereas in nuclear fusion reactor, the fuel which is used is the isotope of hydrogen, that is, it can be deuterium and tritium. The nuclear fission reaction works on the principle of breaking up of the heavier nuclei into the lighter nuclei, whereas a nuclear fusion reaction works on the principle of the lighter nuclei coming together in order to form the heavier nuclei. In case of the nuclear fission reaction, the mass is lost when the heavier nuclei is split, and this mass is in turn converted into energy based upon the principle of E is equal to mc square. Whereas in case of nuclear fusion reaction, the mass is lost when the heavy nuclear is formed. But once again, in this particular case, the mass which is lost gets converted into energy based upon the principle of E is equal to mc square. Now the nuclear fusion reactors are considered to be much better as compared to the nuclear fission reactors because the amount of energy that gets released in the fusion reactors, this is much higher as compared to the reactors based upon the principle of the nuclear fission. Now, even though the nuclear fusion reactors are considered to be much better as compared to the nuclear fission reactors, the construction of nuclear fusion reactors is considered to be technologically challenging. This is so because, as discussed before, in case of the nuclear fusion reactor, two positively charged nuclei needs to come together to form a heavier nuclei. But the very fact that both these nuclei are positively charged, they repel each other. Hence, in order to ensure that these two positively charged nuclei come together, they have to overcome this repulsion. And this can be possible by having very high amount of temperature as well as pressure. So as discussed before, in order to construct a nuclear fusion reactor, we would have to ensure a temperature that is at least 6 times the temperature of the core of the sun. Similarly, the pressure should be very high. So the need to have a very high temperature and the very high pressure, this can be one of the major hindrances for the construction of the nuclear fusion reactors. It is to be noted that the nuclear fusion is a source of energy for the sun as well as stars. Since the construction of the nuclear fusion reactors is considered to be technologically challenging, more than 25 countries across the world, including India, they have come together in a collaboration known as the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactors. As part of such a collaboration, these countries are pooling in their resources to build the nuclear fusion reactors. So whatever nuclear fusion reactors that we come across, they are presently in the experimental stage. Even the recently built nuclear fusion reactor in China, which is called as HL2M tokamak, it is also an experimental nuclear reactor. There are a number of benefits of the nuclear fusion reactors as compared to the nuclear fission reactors. First and foremost, in case of the nuclear fission reactors, the problem is of availability of fuel. So as discussed before, we need heavier and unstable nuclei, that is uranium, plutonium, thorium, etc., which are quite difficult to find naturally. Secondly, these nuclear reactors, they produce huge amount of radioactive waste which become quite difficult to manage. On the other hand, as far as the nuclear fusion reactors are concerned, the fuel in this particular case is quite easily available because we use the isotopes of hydrogen. No radioactive waste are produced in the nuclear fusion reactors, and hence the nuclear fusion reactors are considered to be carbon free and environment friendly source of energy. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. Now the next article appears on page number 14 and is titled as RBI tightens the oversight of the non-banking financial companies and urban cooperative banks. The non-banking financial companies have grown rapidly in the recent times. The NBFCs complement the efforts of the banking sector in providing the credit and thus promote economic growth and development. However, in recent times, the NBFC sector is facing a number of problems and constraints. First and foremost, we have seen a failure of number of NBFCs such as Island FS as well as DHFL. Secondly, the repeated failure of NBFCs can have an adverse impact on India's banking sector. And thirdly, concerns have been raised with respect to poor regulation of NBFCs. See, if you look at the working model of NBFCs, the NBFCs normally raise loans through the issuance of the commercial papers. As we discussed, the commercial papers are basically the short-term instruments in order to raise short-term loans. So the NBFCs raise money through the issuance of the commercial papers. Usually these commercial papers are bought by banks and various other financial institutions. Once this particular money is raised, the NBFCs in turn give this particular money in the form of long-term loans to various infrastructure companies. So if you look at the liabilities of the NBFCs, the liabilities are mainly short-term in nature, but their assets, that is the loans which they give to the infrastructure companies, these assets are mainly long-term in nature. So in a way, this is in turn creating a problem of asset liability mismatch. So whenever there are large scale delay in the completion of infrastructure projects, the NBFCs would not be able to recover their loan amount. And if they are not being able to recover the loan amount, obviously the NBFCs will not be in a position to pay back the money to the banks and the financial institutions. Hence, whenever the NBFCs have failed to repay back the loans which they have raised to the issuance of commercial papers, this in turn have an adverse impact on the banks and the financial institutions. This we refer to as the contagion impact of the poor performance of NBFCs on the financial sector. Hence, in order to strengthen the regulation of the non-banking financial companies, the Reserve Bank of India is set to come out with a number of measures. Some of these measures include strengthening the internal audit mechanism, mandatory appointment of auditors by the NBFCs, and so on. See, as far as these measures which have been highlighted in the article to strengthen the regulation of NBFCs is concerned, these aspects are not important from the perspective of the UPSC examination. What is actually important is the difference between banks and NBFCs and who are the regulators for the different categories of the non-banking financial companies. See, as far as the difference between banks and NBFCs are concerned, banks are incorporated under the Banking Regulation Act 1949. On the other hand, NBFCs, as the name suggests, they are incorporated under the Companies Act. Secondly, the banks can accept both demand deposits as well as the fixed deposits, whereas NBFCs, they cannot accept the demand deposits. They can accept only the fixed deposits. Nextly, see, whenever you deposit the money in the bank, you get a deposit insurance of up to rupees 5 lakh, which means to say you deposit the money in a particular bank, and if the bank has failed, the total amount of money which you are liable to get from the bank in the event of its failure is rupees 5 lakhs. Earlier, this was rupees 1 lakh, but last year the government has decided to increase it to rupees 5 lakhs. As far as NBFCs are concerned, the deposit insurance is not applicable to the NBFCs. Now, this deposit insurance is provided by an organization which is referred to as Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation. Nextly, see, the banks are considered to be part of the payment and settlement system of the Reserve Bank of India, and hence they can issue their own checks. Whereas NBFCs, they are not part of the payment and settlement system, and accordingly, they cannot issue their own checks. Nextly, the concept of cash reserve ratio is applicable to the banks, whereas it is not applicable to the NBFCs. Cash reserve ratio, as we must be aware, certain percentage of the depositors' money the banks are required to keep with the RBI, that we call it as the CRR. On the other hand, certain percentage of the depositors' money which the banks are required to maintain with themselves, that is referred to as SLR. Now, this concept of SLR is applicable to the banks. As far as NBFCs is concerned, this is applicable only to the deposit taking NBFCs. So the NBFCs are basically categorized into two types depending upon how they are mobilizing their resources. We have basically two types, that is deposit taking NBFCs and the non-deposit taking NBFCs. The deposit taking NBFCs basically mobilize resources by taking the deposits from the public, whereas a non-deposit taking NBFCs do not rely on the public deposits, rather they rely on other instruments such as the commercial papers in order to raise the resources. Lastly, as you must be aware, the Reserve Bank of India has come up with the capital adequacy norms under the Basel III guidelines. Now, these capital adequacy norms are applicable to the banks. However, they are applicable only to the deposit taking NBFCs and those NBFCs which are categorized as systematically important. Presently, the RBI categorizes all those NBFCs whose assets are more than 500 crores as the systematically important NBFCs. As far as the regulation is concerned, presently there is no single regulator of the NBFCs. Rather, the NBFCs, depending upon the category they belong to, they are regulated by different regulators. For instance, microfinance institutions, core investment companies. Core investment companies are basically those companies which have been set up in order to make an investment in other companies. The investment and credit companies, these are the companies that provide credit to the other companies. Infrastructure debt company, these are the companies that provide loans for the creation of infrastructure. So companies such as L&FS, they are considered to be infrastructure debt company. And lastly, the gold companies. All these categories of NBFCs are regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. As far as the housing finance companies are concerned, earlier these companies were regulated by the National Housing Bank, but recently the government has decided to pass on this particular baton on to the RBI for their regulation. The SEBI regulates the mutual fund companies, stock broking companies, and the venture capital funds. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs regulates the Nidhi companies, whereas the state government regulates the chit fund companies. Since questions have been raised with respect to poor regulation of different categories of NBFCs, one can get a question in the prelims related to this particular aspect. Now, the next article appears on page number 14. In the Union Budget 2020-21, the Finance Minister had announced the launch of the National Technical Textile Mission. Now, the Ministry of Textiles, which is the implementation ministry for this particular mission, has invited proposals from the various export promotion councils. The export promotion councils are required to give suggestions to the Ministry of Textiles as to what measures should have to be undertaken in order to boost the export of the technical textiles from India. Now, the article that we are going to discuss here shall be important from the perspective of prelims Indian economy. So, in case of India, the textiles can be categorized into two types, that is the conventional textiles and the technical textiles. The conventional textiles are basically produced from fabrics such as cotton, silk, etc. and they are basically used for the aesthetic purposes, that is for the purpose of clothing. On the other hand, the technical textiles as such, they are basically manufactured primarily for their functional properties rather than for aesthetic purposes. Now, for instance, fishing nets, mosquito nets, floor and wall coverings, mattress and pillow, diapers, sanitary napkins, airbags, seat belts, helmets, industrial gloves, bulletproof jackets, etc. can be considered to be a technical textiles. These are manufactured not for their aesthetic purposes, but they are manufactured because of the functions which can be carried out through these textiles. Now, these technical textiles find a wider application in number of industries. They find application in the field of agriculture, transportation, defense, sports, etc. So there are a number of benefits associated with the technical textiles. For example, they can increase the productivity in the Indian agriculture. Bulletproof jackets and other technical textiles can provide better protection to our defense forces. The airbags, helmets, seat belts, etc. provide for a safer transportation. Then technical textiles such as the sanitary napkins improve the hygiene and healthcare of the general public. See, in case of India, if you look at the conventional textiles, India has emerged as one of the largest producer of the conventional textiles across the world. It is a net exporter of the conventional textiles. However, when it comes to technical textiles, the overall demand for the technical textiles is much higher than the overall production. That is why India has emerged as a net importer of technical textiles. So much so that the annual import of the technical textiles is as high as around $16 billion. Now, the global technical textile production is considered to be worth $250 billion. However, India presently accounts for only around 6% of the global technical textile production, with a production value of only around $16 billion. Hence, in order to boost the production of the technical textiles, the finance minister in the Union Budget 2020-21 has decided to launch the National Technical Textile Mission. This mission, as stated before, would be implemented by the Ministry of Textiles. This mission would be implemented for a period of 4 years, starting from 2020 to 23-24. It has basically 4 components. The first component focuses on bringing about research and innovation in the field of technical textiles. The second component focuses on developing the market for the technical textiles. Component 3 focuses on boosting the export of the technical textiles from the Indian economy. Component 4 basically focuses on providing the necessary training and skill development to undertake the manufacturing of the technical textiles in India. As far as the prelims is concerned, you should basically understand as to what exactly are the technical textiles in India, what is the status of the technical textile production, and certain basic details about the National Technical Textile Mission, such as which ministry is implementing this mission. Next, we have an article on page number 14. In its latest monetary policy, the Reserve Bank of India has decided to keep the policy rates unchanged. At the same time, the RBI has decided to continue with the accommodative policy stance, which it has been doing so far. In this regard, this particular article highlights that even though the Reserve Bank of India has decided to maintain the policy rates, the very fact that the RBI has continued to follow the accommodative policy stance will lead to higher GDP growth rate in future. Accordingly, let us discuss about the various monetary policy stances followed by the Reserve Bank of India. See, the total amount of money supply in any economy determines its economic growth. If there is a sudden increase in the money supply, obviously it will lead to a higher rate of inflation. Accordingly, in order to control inflation, the RBI would be required to suck out the excess liquidity. In order to do that, the RBI would be required to increase the policy rates. So as the policy rates increase, the rate of interest on loans as well as deposits would also increase, and this will in turn lead to decrease in the money supply. On the other hand, if the money supply in an economy reduces, then it will lead to either economic slowdown or the recession. Hence, the RBI would be required to inject the liquidity. This it does by decreasing the policy rates. So as the policy rates reduce, the rate of interest on loans as well as deposits also reduce, and this in turn will lead to increase in the money supply. Now, depending upon the total amount of money supply or the prevailing rate of inflation in an economy, the RBI may follow 3 types of policy stances. These are the accommodative policy stance, neutral policy stance, and the calibrated policy stance. The accommodative policy stance is followed by the RBI when the economy is facing the economic slowdown. So during the accommodative policy stance, the RBI basically seeks to inject the money into the economy. Under this particular policy stance, the RBI may either decide to keep the policy rates constant as it has done now, or it may decide to reduce the policy rates. But please note that the increase in the policy rates is ruled out. As far as the calibrated tightening is concerned, this is adopted by the RBI whenever there is a higher rate of inflation, and the basic objective is to suck out the excess liquidity. Under this policy stance, the policy rates may either remain constant or they may increase. But the decrease in the policy rates is completely ruled out. As far as a neutral policy stance is concerned, this is followed when the rate of inflation in the Indian economy is stable. So depending upon the total amount of money supply in the Indian economy, the RBI may either inject or suck out the liquidity. So under this policy stance, the policy rates may either increase or decrease. So right now, as stated before, the RBI is following the accommodative policy stance, which means that under this particular stance, the policy rates may either remain constant or they may reduce, but there would be no increase in the policy rates. So since there would be no increase in the policy rates, it is expected that in future the RBI may reduce the policy rates, and this in turn could lead to increase in the money supply and thus revive the Indian economy. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now the answers to the questions that were posed before the start of the discussion has been presented on your screen. As far as the answers to question number 4 and question number 7 is concerned, please try to find out the answers on your own and respond in the comments section. Now coming to the question for the day. Now the answer for the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS was option C.